All righty then. Boy, oh boy, do I hope that I am doing this correctly. So, because I don't have to record this twice. So this will be our 2 lectures. Here, I'm actually gonna move myself to the center because I'll look. There we go. I can be at least. I don't know if you guys can see that. I don't think you can actually, but whatever. This will be 2 lectures in one. You can see the time, obviously, because by the time you guys see this, it'll be completed, but I can't. I am not expecting this to be terribly long, but I have combined 2 lectures into one, and that's how we're going to do it. That way you guys can just kind of watch this one and move on. Now, the one thing I always say in situations like this is often you don't have to, I don't have pictures on the screen as anything more than kind of just visual aids. So if you would rather kind of treat this like a podcast, put this on your phone, because this is obviously going to be uploaded on YouTube. Put this on your phone, put some headphones in, keep it in your pocket, and just listen to it. That is totally fine. That said, you do have to take notes. So here's how you're going to get participation for this. It's 2 parts. And if you don't do both parts, you don't get participation. And so the first part is that you have to take notes. You got to show me handwritten notes or typed. Either way will work. And then I am going to mention 3 key words. These are secret code words, if you will, that prove that you paid attention throughout the entire thing. So the entire lecture. So at 3 points, I'm going to give you guys 3 secret words. And then you also have to show me the handwritten notes. You can kind of, if you want to just do handwritten notes, and when I give a secret word, you just put it in there and kind of highlighted it. Or if you want to do your handwritten notes or typed, again, notes in one section of a sheet, and then your 3 keywords in the other, that's fine too. And then just for fun, I'm not going to tell you what the 3 keywords, there's a theme to those keywords, by the way. I'm not going to tell you ahead of time, or I'm not going to tell you in the lecture at all what the keywords are, but then when you email this to me, so if you handwrite notes, just take a picture of it. If you type it, then you just, kind of record, send a doc. When you do that, then just kind of say the theme of the 3 keywords were, just for fun. That part is for fun. If you just show me the 3 keywords plus your notes, then that's fine. So just remember, it's a 2-part process to get your participation. And it's for the week. And this is our Thanksgiving learning experience. So it's 2 parts. You have to do the notes and you have to send me the keywords. So today what we're discussing is reapportionment, redistricting, gerrymandering, and the history and actually forget future and the history of political parties in the United States. So again, this is to finish up the political participation and voting lecture series. Traditionally, this has been done over 2 days, but I'm going to just do it in 1 lecture, and I've kind of shrunk it down a little bit too, just to make it a little bit quicker. So I've got a time frame of how long I expect this to be, or I'm kind of hoping this to be. Let's see if I can hit it. But obviously, again, you guys know how long this is taken already, just because you can see the time. So we're going to start with organizing of congressional districts. So reapportionment. So there's 2 processes in the designing of congressional districts. So Arizona has 9 districts. California, I believe, has like 52, 53. Idaho has 2, that kind of thing. So the congressional districts are composed, as you probably know, I probably would have discussed it, but you would know this for somewhere else, based on population. It's constitutionally mandated that districts be designed with similar populations. And the reason why we do it every 10 years, they change every 10 years, is based on the United States Senate census. And that's because populations shift. People move out, people move in, populations grow, populations shrink. And so lines have to be redrawn to make sure that at least at the start of those 10-year period, the number of people that each congressman is representing is the same, is very, very close. I mean, they're allowed to be off by a few thousand, but whatever, it's as close as they can make it. And then obviously because of the way populations are grouped, the way where we move, and because of natural landmarks in terms of mountain ranges or deserts, it's impossible to just kind of draw these districts into straight grids. They have to be kind of, by natural forces, have to be kind of funkily drawn. That's why, I mean, look at the map behind you, not behind you, excuse me, but behind these 2 kind of bubble paragraphs. You can see the lines are all kind of funky drawn. There's no straight lines, it's all squiggly. Well, it's just because populations, we don't move and live in square grids. We live in very abstract and almost unpredictable manners. I mean, it's just kind of how things grow out. So reapportionment is the process in which all 435 congressional House seats are reallocated among the states after every 10 years. So again, it's based on the census, and so reapportionment is the taking of the full state-based population. The national population, the national census, is irrelevant in this case. It's just based by state by state. State legislatures are the one that draw the congressional districts. It's not nationally done. And so that is then the taking of the new population and dividing it by the number of congressional seats that you have. Now, congressional seats, the number that a state has, rises and grows again based on population shifts. So Arizona, for instance, had been adding one new seat every decade based on population growth until the 2010s. So beginning in 1960, the state had been adding one more every 10 years. In 1960, the state got another congressional district. In 1970, they got another 80, so on and so forth. In the 19-teens, we actually technically should have been adding a new one for the 1920s, for the 2020, excuse me. But actually the state screwed up in their counting. So the initial census reporting, it's something that in fact, I'd have to go back and double check. But regardless, this is the first time since the 1950s, this coming decade with the 2020s, is the first time since the 1950s that we have not added a seat. We have now remained stagnant. California, on the other hand, because of population shifts out, we have been have been losing a seat every decade. California, the number of congressmen that they have in DC based out of the House has shrunk every decade. Now they still, again, at 53, they're the largest, most populous state in the nation. They thus, just based on that alone, are the most powerful congressionally. But regardless, whichever, whether you're adding or subtracting or you're staying the same, but your population still has grown or shrunk, the reapportionment is taken of the total number of people in the population of your state and then dividing it by the number of seats that you'll have for the next decade. So seats thus in the House will be allocated based on that population. Recently, the Supreme Court has provided that the census had to reflect the actual counts of the population. Like it made it even more specific than states have been kind of fudging it for a few decades. So therefore, census data is that much more important to political power. And obviously, because let's just say a state's legislature is controlled by the Republicans, like Arizona's, they might be more inclined. Although Arizona Republicans don't have control of the redistricting process, but hypothetically, a state like Arizona, which the legislature might have more control, they might be more inclined to kind of help out the Republican congressmen. In states like California, where the Democrats have supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, they are more inclined to help out the Democrat counterparts in the House and make sure that the House seats, there are many Democrat House seats as possible. And in this case, I'd have to look, but in 2020, it's something like 53-6. I mean, it's just something insane. The number, or excuse me, it wouldn't be 53-6. It'd be like 47-6, 47 Democrats to 6 Republicans. It's something just, totally skewed in favor of the Democrats. Now, a lot of this because of population registering, but regardless, I'm just saying, like, they are inclined to provide more seats for the Democrats in the House. So that is reapportionment. Now, redistricting is the actual then redrawing of the lines. So this is, the power is in the state legislature to get these lines drawn, but not all state legislatures are actually in control of the redrawing. Some state legislatures have given that control to what are known as independent redistricting committees, and that varies within those states that have that, how that works out. In Arizona in particular, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats are added to this board, and then there's 1 independent. Now, I don't know if I've made this comment, but I'm just going to tell you all right now, there's no such thing as an independent voter. So just because you're a Republican doesn't mean you're an independent voter. Just because you're a Democrat registered doesn't mean you're an independent voter. It's a bogus, garbage, throwaway title to give yourself. It's regardless of your party registration right now, I'm sure that, the party doesn't tell you specifically how to think. you think for yourself and you think I agree with Republicans, or you think for yourself and you think I agree with Democrats. That's why you register, is because I think I should be there, not because a party has designated you're a Democrat, you're a Republican. So therefore, that independent panelist, which is the kind of the seventh person that on that committee, in Arizona, they are the tiebreaker, but they lean left or right. And so that obviously does naturally skew things one way or the other. So now, what is gerrymandering? You've probably heard this term. Gerrymandering is the process of redrawing the lines and intentionally drawing them to skew one way or the other. So for instance, let's just say that we've got 50 precincts within a state, and a state is able to add 5 or have 5 seats in the House. How might these lines be drawn? Well, you can see that 60% of these precincts are the majority of the voters are registered Democrats, and then 40% of the precincts. I don't know if you can see my mouse, because all of a sudden now I can't see my mouse. Hold on. Oh, you can't. I can't. Oh, there it is. Okay. Hopefully you can see it. And then 40% of these precincts, the majority of the voters are registered Republican. So there are 2 ways of drawing this. Well, there are an infinite number of ways, but there are 2 kind of like very distinct ways. One is drawing the lines to just guarantee that 60% of the voters in all 5 districts are Democrat, therefore giving Democrats control of majority, again, in terms of the electorate, control over 5 districts. Another way can actually be to draw them in a very skewed manner. And notice how this is done. So in this district, 60% of the voters happen to be Republican. In this district, 90% of the voters happen to be Democrat. So it's a super heavy Democrat district. And then you've got 2 of those, again, 90% right here. But then in these 3 over here, it is 60% Republican, 60% Republican, 60% Republican, which actually gives the Republicans 3 seats versus Democrats 2. So even though the Republicans are outnumbered overall, it was hypothetically gerrymandered to either fit the Democrats and give the Democrats complete control over all 5 seats, or to skew it to give Republicans 3 seats. And really it just has to do with who's in control. Because hypothetically, you could have a gerrymandered kind of setting where the districts look a little bit more like this, but the Republicans were still given like 1 seat, or even given 2 seats. Those still don't have control over the entire 5 seats, or the majority of them, that is, but it still hypothetically could have been set up to give them at least a little bit greater control. The first key word is turkey. Secret word is turkey. So then partisan gerrymandering, is the process in a state legislature whereby the majority party draws districts to maximize the number of House seats that their party can win. So that is obviously then intentionally party based. So gerrymandering, this definition right here is just the process of drawing lines to benefit one group. That is just kind of the base definition. Partisan is then when specifically the party that is in control of the legislature, which again, constitutionally, they're the first voice in the control of the redrawing of districts, they draw them specifically to benefit themselves. So for instance, Democrats might draw, we're going to look at this one, might draw districts that would split a historically Republican district and force an incumbent, excuse me, this isn't necessarily this one in particular, this is just kind of the definition or an example. Democrats might draw districts that would split a historically Republican district and force an incumbent Republican to run in a new, more liberal district, a tactic called cracking, or even draw districts to concentrate as many opposition party voters as possible, called packing, so the party drawing the districts can more easily win in surrounding districts. And that is what this one is. And that's packing Democrats as heavily as possible into 2 districts to then give the Republicans, in this case, the kind of majority of control. Now, I'll offer just a little bit of history on my side, and that is that what happened here with this cracking thing is actually what happened with my boss when I was working for the United States House back in 2010. We came in and we were in a very Republican district. And so we kind of expected, all right, when the districts are redrawn in 2010, when we run for 2012, we're going to have a very safe Republican district because, why would they want to hurt an incumbent Republican? Well, it wasn't. We're actually pitted against another Republican. The way the lines were drawn, they specifically and intentionally drew it to hurt the Republican Party, so that 2 sitting congressmen, very popular conservative congressmen, in two very red districts were forced to face off against one another in the primary. The other guy won, my boss lost, since now my boss is now out of office. And that was exactly what the committee wanted. They didn't care which one won or lost. They only cared that one of these two very popular sitting Republican congressmen were going to lose seats. And that was because the Democrats controlled the independent redistricting, the, again, air quote, independent redistricting committee. Now, why do I say air quote? Because back in 2010, that independent, her husband worked for Barack Obama. So where do you think she leaned for, at the time, President Barack Obama? So where do you think she leaned? So they intentionally, the Democrats, the four of them, were able to outnumber the three Republicans. They drew it to screw the Republicans in that case, and my guy lost. So as a result of partisan gerrymandering, it is easily possible for a party to win win a substantial majority of seats in the legislature while losing the statewide popular vote. And that is what we see here in the right example. So obviously the overall popular vote, the Republicans would have lost because 60% of those precincts were Democrats, excuse me. But they managed to win more, and again, they could manage to win 3 out of the 5. Now, of course, though, it could absolutely be flipped. That's just the example here in this image. So pro-incumbent gerrymandering happens when legislators agree to create districts to enhance the electoral security of both parties. And that's why you kind of get these like really squiggly, like, what the heck does this mean kind of thing. And so this tends to occur, though, when the state legislature is divided so closely that neither party can dictate the redistricting process. Thus, they just agree to help each other out and then create, so let's just say in Arizona, again, we've got 9. They would, hypothetically create 4 very strong red, 4 very strong blue, and then 1 like in the middle, and then just say, it just becomes a coin flip every 2 years kind of thing. So that would be, pro-incumbent. Racial gerrymandering is, of course, when district lines are drawn to lump people of a certain race in very tightly packed districts. So this happens on behalf of blacks, this happens, to hurt blacks, this happens on behalf of whites, this happens to hurt whites, this happens on behalf of Mexicans, this happens to hurt Mexicans. So while we might instinctively think that it might happen one way or the other to help or hurt a particular group, it happens all across the board. In Arizona in particular, the district that I live in is intentionally by Democrats drawn very much to lump in a bunch of Mexican Democrats. I happen to live in a growingly predominantly Mexican American district. And so Mexicans tend to vote Democrat. There's the word of the semester is the tend. Mexicans tend to vote Democrat. And so the Democrats drew this line to lump them in to allow them to vote kind of together. And so, obviously there was no racist intention there, but it was very racial. It wasn't meant to hurt Mexicans. It was meant to give them a solid Mexican voting bloc. And of course, I shouldn't say of course as in like duh, but I mean, it was just very logical that they elected a Mexican Democrat congressman who now sits in the House and has for, I think he's been there for 4 or 6 years. And he replaced, by the way, a Mexican Democrat who had been in office for like 30 years. So this kind of stuff happens all the time. Now, in some instances, can a group of people be placed into a district to kind of create one of these like 90% districts and hurt them? Yes, I mean, and it does happen. However, it happened more predominantly, it has happened most predominantly in the South throughout history, and it happened more predominantly prior to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which I have here, which was intended to ease the way for African Americans to exercise greater, I shouldn't say just say there, but greater voting rights by actually spreading them out in districts. The intention with this was actually to make sure that some of these big clumps of Black Americans in southern states, it was, I think, 7 southern states, I should have looked it up beforehand, that it actually made sure that they were spread out among multiple districts, so that way they could have a greater voice over multiple districts instead of kind of being lumped into 1, 2, or 3 out of 8, 10, 12, 15, that kind of thing. So it does happen in both ways. However, since the 1982 Voting Rights Act, so obviously there was a second one 17 years later, both Republicans and minority groups, political activists have backed the formation of majority minority districts, and with African Americans or Hispanics constituents are the majorities and are lumped together. And that is what we have here in my district. This has the effect of concentrating enough minority citizenship to elect one of their own, as again happened in my district. And at the same time, it takes these obviously now usually Democratic voters out of the pool of voters in other districts, a process that is occasionally termed bleaching, because obviously now it's because people are white, thus, or some people are white, thus making it easier for non-minority districts to be won by Republicans. So again, it's racial or color-based gerrymandering, but it does help certain groups, and it can be used to hurt certain groups, and so on and so forth. So cumulatively speaking, the legal battles over racial gerrymandering, have actually made it very difficult to prove intentionality of gerrymandering along racial lines. Which is basically gutted parts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which I feel like I have discussed that briefly with you guys in the past. But it still is very strongly, it's no longer actually directly enforced by the Department of Justice, but the law still exists. So in recent cases, the Supreme Court declared that race cannot be the predominant factor in drawing congressional lines, which prior it was. Although, yeah, anyway, I could go so deep into that. It can be considered, but so must other factors such as neighborhood and community preservation. So there's a number of factors. And again, I wish I had thought of this, as was designed of this instead of as I'm giving a lecture, which happens. But Arizona actually has a list of 5 to 7 very specific requirements for the redistricting committee to design districts. And the first one and the last one is competitiveness. So it's like number 7 is competitiveness. I mean, it's supposed to be like fairness and equality and all these other things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 is like competitiveness. So I mean, like there's a number of things that the redistricting committee is supposed to look at, and just Arizona specifically. That's all I know, offhand at least, to create fair and equitable districts throughout the state. All right, so the 2 major parties, these, and these definitions, so I should be able to fly through them pretty quickly. But the Democratic Party ideology is generally pro-choice. There are pro-life Democrats, but for the most part, they are pro-choice, pro-abortion. Right now, it is growing more and more within the Democratic Party to provide air quote free college tuition. The reason why I say air quote is that universities still need to get paid. Professors like myself need to get paid. The administrators and the deans and the president of universities, they all need to get paid. Otherwise, nobody's going to want these jobs. If hey, go be a teacher for free. No, thank you. I'd rather go flip burgers at McDonald's so I at least can have a salary. The janitors need to get paid. Electricity needs to be stayed on. So it isn't free. All it means by free tuition is just that you don't have to pay out of pocket when you enroll. It's just enroll and go take a class. But all that means then is that the federal government will just raise taxes on everybody to then be able to collect money and then funnel it back into the university, so everybody down the line can get paid and we can keep the air on, the electricity on, the lights on, the water running. So all that means is just, hey, let's take college tuition out of the hands of the people and put it in the hands of the government and let them just pay for it. I will say this though, throughout history, those kinds of government programs, and we're talking outside of the United States, we're talking not just the United States, but all around, it never, ever works. Ever. Go look it up. It is an abject failing proposition, a failing program. But if you do go to college, you don't have to pay out of pocket. You just sign up and you just sit down in the class. The Democrat Party tends to be more willing to spend on the national debt, take the infrastructure bill that just passed and take the next bill that was like 1.2 trillion and take the next bill that's going to be probably passed in the next couple of weeks. I know the Democrats' goal is to have it passed before the Christmas recess. Both of those are huge multi-trillion-dollar bills that will add trillions and trillions of dollars to the national debt. They don't see national debt as a means of restraint. They see it as, it's just kind of a byproduct of spending, and they just kind of move on. The only problem with that, well, there's a number of problems with spending to that sense and not having control over spending, is that it causes inflation, which means the value of your money becomes less and less and less. Your buying power decreases tremendously. If you know anything about the housing market right now, you would understand exactly what I mean. If you know anything about the car market right now, you know exactly what I mean. If you know anything about gasoline prices right now, you know exactly what I mean. It means things cost more, which means but you didn't get these major raises that allows you to afford the rising prices of homes, cars, gasoline, and food prices are going up. All it means is that things cost more because businesses aren't making as much as they had been, but you didn't get a raise, which means the value of the money that you have in your wallet is far less than it did prior to inflation. So it's just going to cause a lot of inflationary problems. Democrats tend to promote gun control, and the Democrats in government tend to vote on and try to pass legislation that restricts gun control in some ways. The Supreme Court twice in the last decade has reaffirmed the right to bear arms via the Second Amendment. So at the moment, the Supreme Court is very much on the side of one's right to own and carry a gun, but Democrats tend to want to restrict it. So again, I say tend because there are plenty of Democrat gun owners. It's not a universal truth, but historically and traditionally, Democrats do tend to push those kinds of things. Democrats do tend to want to raise taxes. They claim they specifically want to raise taxes on the rich and companies, but eventually the rich and companies either move their money out of the United States so that they can't be taxed as high, or they stop making money because they're being taxed too high. And so then everybody else has to have their taxes raised. So one of the things about the Build Back Better infrastructure bill that was passed in law was Democrats kept saying, Biden, Pelosi, they all kept saying, it's a free bill, it's a free bill, it's a free bill. We're just going to tax the rich and corporations. Well, they haven't yet, which means at the moment it's not free, and they probably won't be able to. They probably won't get a massive tax rise bill passed. I mean, it's even moderate Democrats don't like that plan, and so which is why it will be adding to the debt guaranteed, because they're not going to be able to get that kind of money from the air quote wealthy. And then finally, Democrats are obviously no fan of terrorism and terrorist organizations. So while they might not necessarily be as willing to use military force on terrorist organizations as Republicans might, obviously they want to deter it. Not detour. Well, I guess you could detour terrorism, like move it away, but I mean, what I meant by that was deter, like prevent it. So it's just, again, they might not necessarily be as war hawkish, if you know that term, as Republicans tend to be, or could theoretically be. Republicans, on the other hand, and by the way, the second secret word is ambrosia. Ambrosia. So Republicans tend to be pro-life. Are there pro-choice, pro-abortion Republicans? Absolutely. Again, but the majority of them, and it is pulled as the majority of Republicans, are pro-life, and thus they do not support abortive options. In terms of education, the Republicans tend to support private lenders rather than the government subsidies, which brings down the cost of bureaucratic costs on education. Republicans although Republicans can very much be heavy spenders, it does happen. This is very much not a universal truth. But Republicans tend to support bills that pay down the debt and then place caps on spending. So it's very much kind of a small government point of view. In terms of healthcare, they've said now for what year we're in, we're 2021. They have said for 13, 14 years now, they want to repeal Obamacare and get something better. Health insurance prices have skyrocketed since Obamacare. It's actually made, the thing was, it'll make healthcare cheaper. It has not made healthcare cheaper. In Arizona, healthcare prices went up some 300 to 500% in just the first year alone. Now they've had opportunities to repeal Obamacare, but they've never been successful in doing it. In terms of guns, Republicans tend to uphold the rights to bear arms, and by tend, it's very much like that one is almost a universal truth. In terms of taxes, they want to close loopholes and curb corporate welfare, which is kind of government subsidies to help corporations and have pro-growth tax codes, which in essence means just lower taxes for everybody, which allows growth in government, or excuse me, not in government, growth in spending and growth in the economy, which obviously, and then from that perspective, the government can very much collect a lot of taxes because people are spending constantly. And then in terms of terrorism, again, Republicans tend to be a little bit more willing to kind of just go after them directly. And so and kind of destroy terrorist organizations, both domestically and overseas. This obviously means killing a lot of bad guys. So just saying. All right, so in terms of what is that, extremism versus moderation. So party activists tend to have more extreme viewpoints because they're very much about the base. So in terms of party activists, in terms of politicians, they tend to be very hardcore about their base. So for the Republicans, it's kind of like the very hardcore conservatives. For the Democrats, it's the very hardcore progressives. Of course, most people land in between. It's probably some, 15 to 20% on the far right, 15 to 20% on the far left. Everybody else is somewhere in the middle, but part of the spectrum. That said, even people who are in the middle, who are Republicans, still generally tend to agree with most of the Republican Party platforms, and same with Democrats. It's just that they might not be as ardently vocal about them and kind of willing to throw party members under the bus who are not quite as ardent as they believe they should be. In diverse districts, a politician tends to have to be more moderate because I've got to be able to appeal to somebody on the opposite side of my political leaning, and I've got to be able to really appeal to the moderates and independents in the middle. Again, there's no such thing as an independent, as if it's different from a registered Republican or Democrat. It's a really stupid, lame name. We are all independent thinkers. But whatever, those people are non-registered. Okay, cool. And then there's negative partisanship, which is the tendency to hate the other party more than liking your own, which has led swings in voting in modern times. So in other words, often there were plenty of there were plenty of people who voted for Donald Trump who simply hated Hillary Clinton, or simply hated the Democrat Party. They might not have loved the Republican Party. They might not have loved Trump. They might not have even liked Trump, but they hated Democrats or the party. Hopefully they don't hate the individuals, or they did hate Hillary Clinton, at least where she stood, or they thought she could be as a leader that much. All right, so now the history of political parties. So the first party era. So in other words, there are 5 parties. 6. I forget. 6. There are 6 party eras throughout history. So we're going to discuss the first party era here. So in the 1790s, there were a host of disagreements among early American politicians that led Alexander Hamilton and John Adams to essentially organize the Federalist Party, the group of legislators who supported their views. And these people were, in essence, so today they would essentially be modern day Democrats, probably still lowercase d versus capital D. But really what it just meant back then was that they supported the federal government versus as the central kind of primary power versus state governments, which would have been at the time, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, the anti-federalists, which essentially supported states' rights more primarily and state-centric governance over federal governance. So thus, then later, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison would do the same thing and create kind of the Democratic Republicans, again, kind of known as Jeffersonian Democrats or Jeffersonian Republicans, or more commonly anti-federalists. And again, these are people who would now be modern day Republican, although they would be modern day conservative libertarians. They were very much kind of far right. Issues were different back then. So when you hear that term kind of far right, it doesn't quite mean what you might think it means today. But it does mean that they were on the right side of the spectrum, generally more Republican, modern day Republican. So over the course of the next decade, into the 1800s, these organizations expanded beyond their legislative purposes, to include recruiting candidates to run as members of their party for both Congress and the presidency. So remember, well, I suppose if you don't know, I shall teach you. But if you did know, George Washington is the only nonpartisan president in American history. He's the only president who was not a part of a political party. Now, there's two reasons for that. A, when the nation started, parties known as back then factions were seen as a deterrent to democracy. They're actually seen as something that could hurt the United States. George Washington would say in his second, or excuse me, not his second, but would say in his leaving office, his final address, essentially, that political parties were actually going to hurt the United States and help foreign governments, kind of intrude. So he hated them. Excuse me. Well, that was actually, I just kind of mixed them both in. A, there was no such thing when he entered office, and B, he hated them. So as they developed, he just refused to be a part of them. That said, he was in practice a Federalist. He was very much a federal government kind of promoter, supporter, and obviously as president, he trying to there we go, give me back a little bit. He obviously wanted to exercise those powers. So the concerns of the states versus federal powers and the rights dominated the discussion of this era. Should the federal government be more in power, hence Federalists? Should the states have greater power, hence anti-Federalists? So that's the first party era. The second party era began in about 1828 when Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson turned it was Federalist, then the Democrat Party developed, the now Democrat Party away from a focus on the party in government, creating the country's first mass-based party and setting the stage for the development of voter-oriented party machine. In other words, what they created was the citizen-led parties, which essentially is what we are now because of this. And so because of this evolution, then political machines, these political operatives, these Democrats, these Republicans, the Republican Party didn't exist back then. At this point, it was still the Whigs, but the future, Republican Party, they would create these machines that would then kind of be in control of the party from a private position, from a private environment. And so these party machines were tightly organized party systems within each state, within each city, and even at the county levels that kept control of voters by getting them jobs, helping them out financially when necessary, and in fact, becoming a part of their lives and their communities. And so people started to see themselves for the first time as members of political parties, almost as much as members of a state and as members of the nation. So you truly were a Republican, an Arizonan, and an American. Well, Arizona didn't exist back then, but let's just say, a Republican, a Virginian, and an American, that kind of thing. And people might even say that they were a Republican, a Whig, or a Democrat first, even before they said a Virginian, let alone an American. By the way, people didn't really reference themselves as American until World War I. You were, in essence, always a member of your state first until World War I. And the reason for that I won't get into, but to state that I'm an American before I'm an Arizonan, or I'm an American before I'm a Californian, or I'm an American before I'm a Floridian, that didn't begin until World War I, so within the last 100 years. So Jacksonian Democrats enacted a number of party and government reforms designed to enhance the control of these party leaders, and who would become known as party bosses, even over the candidates, the office holders, and the campaigns themselves. It really would narrow, party power and control really would kind of funnel down into a very small group of people who are, again, unelected, and all they control the party politics. But because they controlled party politics, they also could then control governance, because they could help people get elected and for favors, and then say, you will support certain legislation, or you will, if you are president, you will support a certain, you will appoint certain people to certain positions, so on and so forth. So the most common means for selecting candidates was the party caucus, which we discussed in this class, I think, which is a special meeting of handpicked party leaders who appointed the party nominees. Patronage was then a reward for faithful party supporting with public office jobs and government contracts and so forth. So that's exactly what I was just referencing here a moment ago. And that was that these party bosses, they could help get somebody elected, or they would get somebody elected, and then by doing so, then they would, if elected, you now owe the party bosses favors. And again, that could be voting on specific legislation, that could be enacting specific regulations, and that could also be the appointment of specific party people to certain positions to guarantee, the party boss's friends to get in office. So Whigs, which again was the party that died, that allowed the Republican Party to create, to kind of be formed under their ashes. So because the Democrat Republicans lost big to Jackson, it fractured and became the Whig Party. And again, that would be the party that would then fracture and die itself over the issue of slavery, and become the Republican Party. And so, of course, sure, I've discussed this. The Republican Party was founded on the platform of ending slavery in the United States. Democrats have historically always been the pro-subordination of the minority groups in the United States. And it has historically, and certainly they were the ones that supported slavery, and then tried to, they were the ones who enacted Jim Crow laws. They were the ones that held down the blacks in the South during, up to the Civil Rights era. It was the Republican Party who has historically always been the anti-slavery, anti-oppression party. So the third party era, and here's how we get into it, was the Lincoln Republicanism. And that was, again, the Whigs collapse, they die. The Republican Party is formed on the foundation or on the platform of ending slavery. And what they did is when the Republicans developed, they actually pulled people from the Whig Party, from the Free Soilers, from the Democrat Party, from, everything. It just became this kind of mishmash, and it was all, how do we end slavery in America? And so Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 1858. I should have preceded this, excuse me, with they had their first presidential party candidate in 1856, whose name I'm spacing. I wish I had written. He lost to Democrat James Buchanan, who is now known as is generally known as the worst president in American history, because he, in essence, allowed the Civil War to occur. He could have done things to curb it, but he decided not to. And he essentially said, oh, yeah, let the next guy do it. The next guy ended up being Abraham Lincoln. And so then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who ran as a Republican for Senate in 1858 in Illinois and lost, he then would win the presidential election in 1860. So after the Civil War, an era of regionalism pitted Republicans, Northern and Western, against Democrats, Southerners, and pro-slavery states. And presidential elections were closely contested for a while, but the Republicans tended to continue to hold the political edge. So the fourth political era is populism and industrialism. This would be the late 1800s into the early 1900s. William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, attempted to merge the Democrat Party and the People's Party in a presidential election of 1896. He would actually run for president 4 times and lose 4 times for the Democrats, but he is known as the most influential non-president in American history. He was extraordinarily influential, but he would lose again 4 times. And then he failed to amass enough farmers and industrial voters to win at all. So the splitting of votes between the People's Party and the Democrats only further strengthened the Republican Party. And as economic issues subsided in the late 1890s, I could do an entire history lecture on this, so I'm just trying to skim over the top. But there were a number of economic drops, a bunch of bank runs, and some very intense spending issues. At one point in the late 1890s, Americans actually thought, this is no exaggeration, some Americans actually thought the world was coming to an end because the economic crisis got so bad. And so out of these economic issues, as these economic issues subsided in the late 1890s, the regional bases of Republicans and Democrats only further intensified, and political reforms led to a decrease in voter turnout. The fifth party era is the New Deal era, which is the FDR era. And so the New Deal Democrats included Southern Democrats, Catholic immigrants, primarily coming from Italy and Ireland, blue collar workers who are, a blue collar worker is somebody who essentially works in with their hands. At the time, they were generally industrialists, as well as farmers, because the federal government gave farmers, I mean, millions and millions of dollars in subsidies to kind of be able to help them to continue to plant and farm even through tough economic times. Republicans maintained support among business owners. Those people are known as white collar workers, and that's because they tend to be more desk job workers, as well as industrialists, and strengthened their regional support in the Northeast and then Plains states, which are obviously the central United States. This also, because of the New Deal and many of FDR's government reforms in the wake of the Great Depression, led to a significant expansion of government size and power, the most since the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln expanded federal power through essentially the expansion of his and presidential power in running the war. And then there would be another big jump in the New Deal era. By the way, the third secret word is biscuits. So the sixth party era is de-alignment and fracturing. So, which came obviously post FDR. And so there was a realigning process which mobilized, so we're not, excuse me, I need to preface that as well as being the civil rights era. So the realigning process had mobilized African Americans and other minorities into the Democrat Party and Southern whites into the Republican Party, which it had been the other way around. Creating a greater consistency between partisanship and ideological and issue preferences. And also, by the way, this really did happen in about the 1960s is when things kind of flipped between the Republicans and blacks, in specifically in the South. And then now what we are seeing in recent years that we are starting to slowly see a shift back where now minorities, I even hate to use that term because, again, race doesn't exist. I will say that. You can ask me what I mean by that later in person. But, blacks and Mexicans are now starting, Black Americans and Mexican Americans very specifically, are starting to slowly shift back towards the Republican Party. It is a very slow, kind of a slow drip, if you will, but it is beginning to happen. So it's kind of a quick thing in the 1960s, and we're now starting to see a slow move back in the other direction. So this current era is characterized by a narrowly divided nation as we see intense party competition as we live through, and increased gridlock in government, as you probably know. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you a happy Thanksgiving. So just a reminder, to get participation, you have to submit, you have to email me your notes throughout the lecture, as well as the 3 code words, and then try to guess what the theme is. And again, if you hand wrote notes, which is totally fine, just take a picture, email me a picture. Done. If you typed them, save the doc file, email me the doc file. Although I will actually say this, if you are typing, please don't do it in a doc file. It's actually faster for me to get to it. If you could just copy those and send me an email with your notes, that works perfectly. Formatting is irrelevant to me. I just need to be able to see that you did it. And believe me, I know this lecture, so I'll be able to know that you followed it all the way through and you got the code words and so forth. So actually, please do not send me a doc file. Please just copy their notes if you wrote it in a Microsoft Word doc, and then just email it to me via email. Just literally write me an email, copy, paste, drop it in and send. So please, no doc files. But again, for participation, you cannot get partial participation. For participation, you need to have notes throughout, as well as the 3 code words. And with that, I love you all. I really do. I do wish we could have met. Well, okay, that's a lie. I don't wish we could have met this week because I'm enjoying the time off. But I mean, hey, I like seeing you guys. I really love our class. So just have a great, safe, pleasant, and fun Thanksgiving. Eat a lot. I know I will. I actually love leftovers almost as much as I love the actual, fresh food itself. And I will see you, well, in a little over a week. It is Sunday at 4:41 p.m. right now. So I'll see you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I will see you in 10 days. I love you all. Have a great break. Bye.